Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Rabbi Yehuda Halpert, who is the rabbi of Congregation Avat Shalom in Teaneck, New Jersey, as well as a practicing attorney. And we'll be discussing his new book titled Speaking to an Empty Shul, Timeless Lessons from Unprecedented Times, published by Mosaic Press. And this is a collection of his sermons, of his drashos given during the COVID year. And we're going to discuss this book, and there's some unique features in the book, QR codes, you can listen to the original recordings of WhatsApp messages and whatever, many sources. There's a lot to discuss here. So thank you, Yehuda, for joining me.
Nafi, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. So I grew up in Hillcrest, Queens, in New York. I've been in New York my whole life. I'm I'd say kind of a classic and proud product of Yeshiva University. I'm really carrying on my family's legacy. My grandfather, my father's father, was the personal secretary of Dr. Bernard Revel when he emigrated from Israel to the United States. My grandfather on my mother's side, actually my namesake, who I'm named after, taught in the graduate schools at Yeshiva University. And my father was the coach of Yeshiva University basketball team for over 40 years. So, as we like to say in my family, there's been a Halpert at Yeshiva University in some capacity for over 100 years. I went to MTA. I spent a short stint at Yeshiva Har Etzion in Israel and in the Gris Kollel in Israel. I spent obviously a few years in law school, but otherwise I've pretty much YU through and through, REITs, etc., etc.
Okay, so as I mentioned, so you're a rabbi of a shul. I want to tell I think it's important also to say a little bit about your shul, because that's what the book is relevant to the book, and also a practicing attorney. So you actually do both. You have two jobs.
Correct. I have two jobs. Sometimes it feels like I have four jobs if you put those two jobs together. But it is important. You note that our shul, Congregation Avat Shalom, is a little bit unique, and actually. I have in the intro to the book, I dedicate 4 or 5 pages to the history of our particular community and our shul, just so you can kind of get a sense of who it is and where it's going. So much so that Dr. Jeffrey Gurak, who's a friend of the family and reviewed the book with me, he pointed out he thought that should really be actually a separate essay, because it really was a historical account of this community. So let me tell you a little about the community. So in Teaneck, if you know Teaneck, New Jersey, there's kind of two sections. There's a section which has a lot of houses, and there's also a section which is mostly apartments. And those apartments are a very transient community. People, for the most part, our demographic is relatively on the young side, although the last few years they built a few more apartments, and now there's a little bit of a retired community as well. But it's a transient community, and people kind of float in and out every 3 to 5 years, and this particular minyan is a Shabbos minyan. It meets Friday night Shabbos and Mincha Ma'ariv. We have events. We have kind of all the classics. We have a sisterhood. We have shiurim. We have other things, but it's not a daily minyan because it meets within the high school. And Baruch Hashem, Teaneck, New Jersey has lots of shuls and lots of infrastructure, but this minyan services that particular crowd, and that's actually how I was able to kind of balance being both a practicing attorney and also being a rav. I'm at Deborah Boys in Plimpton, which takes a fair amount of time. I do private equity. I do private equity on the tax side. What I was always interested in learning, obviously, and giving shiurim, and at every point in my career, I was always giving shiurim in some capacity. After minyan, this, that, or the other thing. But I always had my eyes open because I had a little bit of an itch for rabbanos. And when Congregation Avat Shalom, they decided they wanted to kind of formalize a little. They were looking for a part-time rav. So I was like, part-time rav. That way I can I'm a little scared to commit too much. And they were a little short on cash to commit too much. So we were a perfect marriage. And then after a few years of really doing it every other week, or maybe 2 out of every 3 weeks, etc., it became a little bit more formalized. And now, since 2008, I've pretty much been there as the regular Rav in this Shabbos capacity. And Baruch Hashem, thank God, it really has balanced out and worked well.
So as you say, it's a Shabbos shul, really, but one of the things that you do, as evidenced by this book, is giving sermons, giving drashos. And so when do you give a drasha? When do you speak a shul? Every shul and every community has its own thing. The Rav speaks here, the Rav speaks then, right? Friday night, or when he speaks even, is it before Kabbalah Shabbos, after Kabbalah Shabbos? Does he speak, on Shabbos day? When does he speak in before laning, right after laning, before Musaf, right after Musaf, by the Kiddush? Like, when do you speak? How many times on Shabbos do you speak before, because it's, again, relevant to this book, which is a collection of your speeches.
Absolutely. So I would say kind of the main, if you want to call it the sermon, the main drasha, the classic drasha that we give in the shul is right before Musaf. And I aim to be in that sweet spot of 10 to 15 minutes. It's very difficult to develop and deliver a complex and nuanced message in less than 10 minutes, because the way I put, and you'll see this throughout the Derashos, that I have like a kind of a style that I usually fit into. And the first 2-3 minutes is to try to address something that's happened over the course of the past week, something interesting, a little bit more than the classic rabbi joke, to try to draw people in. And then I really try to give 7 to 8 minutes of substantive Torah in every drasha. And that's why I think this sefer, if I'm successful, I tell people, look, it's not a COVID book. It obviously deals with COVID, but there's a lot of Torah. There's a lot of classic drashos in terms of Pasuk Pshat in the Pasuk, how to understand this, why is there a halachic concept in this idea? And actually, for that reason, one of the things that I did in the sefer, you'll see in the back, is an index of sources. So if you just wanted, tell people all the time, if you have to give a bar mitzvah drasha or whatever, you pull it off the shelf, you look at the index in the back, and I have every source cited from Chumash, from Nach, from Gemara, from Rishonim, etc. So it's definitely not, it's not a sefer that, it's not your first look if you're looking to learn parsha, but there's a lot of parsha in here, which I'm very proud of. Going to that 7-8 minute, and this is kind of about drashas generally. Sometimes I feel like there's a struggle. If you're teaching a high level shiur, that the 20 people in front of you are at a certain level. You can speak to them very quickly. You can mention different things. If you speak, depending on who your audience is. When I look at my audience, it's a very diverse crowd. There are folks who are sitting there who have spent multiple years in top yeshivas in Israel, or smicha students from the tri-state area, and there are also folks who have very limited background. And you begin to struggle a little, and you say, hey, and a lot of people come to the conclusion, I can't give a complex idea here. And the reality is, I think that that's not true. I think you have to work a little harder, and you have to really manage how you're going to give the information over, but you can give the most complex Rav Chaim and the most complex lamdus, so long as you kind of narrow it down a little. And when we were talking offline before, you mentioned kind of how does being a lawyer interact with being a rabbi? I'll tell you one particular thing that I think works very. Sometimes they're completely opposite, but one thing. So I do tax law, and the role of a tax lawyer is to take relatively complex aspects of the tax code, which, people say all the time, you like Gemara, you must like tax, right? You take relatively complex areas of the tax law, and you have to explain them to very smart people who are commercial and business people who they don't care about the tax. They just want to know, explain to me how this tax law will impact what I'm going to have to do in terms of how I'm going to have to structure this transaction. And what I do, I wish I was learning all week, but when I'm working, I'm basically diffusing complex ideas and presenting them to people who are interested and need to understand them in a kind of a much more simple way. And really, a good drasha, in my opinion, is that you take a complex idea, you take a nuance in the pasuk. Why does it say? Why is there an extra ace here? Why did it not? Why did it mention? In one of the drashas, I say, hey, in this parsha, it mentions Sarah's name 18 times. That's incredibly unusual. Usually, you don't mention someone's name. Why does it say that? And then you give a machlokas rishonim as to how to understand the pasuk, and then the last 2-3 minutes is, hey, let me give you a message. Let me give you a takeaway. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of.
It does. And I was going to ask you as well is, what's your style generally? You mentioned the style, but if you could just expand a little more on that, because those that are familiar with Drashas Farm, they're very different. You go back to old Drashas, used to be they would quote like a medrash, and then they would start expounding on it, and then obviously there's generally in a drasha there's always a message, and if those that look at historical drashas of different gedolim, you'll see that there's message. You always look at Yehuda's drashas in Prague, you're seeing what was going on in the community and what he's crying about and complaining about. So the message part, yeah, but what is the style Torah-wise of what is generally, how do you structure a drasha generally?
Right, for sure. So I would say style-wise, it's very important to me that at the end of the drasha, someone walks away with knowing that they learned a piece of Torah, knowing that they learned a nuanced idea that they didn't previously know. So I would say kind of the classic style is to do some introduction, present a question. Usually, or oftentimes it's Parsha Nudin, whatever the Parsha is. Sometimes if it's around the holiday or Yontif, it's a particular nuanced question in terms of a halachic question in terms of why do we paskin this way, or a minhag question in terms of, hey, why did the minhag develop that way? And then I will present, usually my style is I present 2 to 3 explanations of that particular question. And usually the first two, I try to get the most classic explanations on that issue. So again, if it's a classic Machlokus Rashi and the Ramban, like how can you discuss whether, how can you possibly say something about about the Mishkan, whether it was, Ein Mukta Mukta B'Torah, without at least mentioning the Machlokus Rashi and the Ramban. But then I'll almost always bring in a third parish, and that third parish is the idea and the takeaway that I want to jump from the parsha. I want to jump from the parsha into the takeaway. And kind of people always ask, like, do you start with the Torah or do you start with the idea? And I usually, thank God now, I'd say after Haggadahs, there is so much content out there in terms of parsha. And if you obviously everyone has their go-to Sfarim, and my family is very connected to the Torah Tamima, and my grandfather was like, I always like to pull from the Torah Tamima, but there's so much stuff out there that I usually look for the issue I want to address first, or something happens, and then I jump to, and then I find Torah that fits in, and then I, obviously, look, you're constrained by the reality of the truth of the Amito Shel Torah. I mean, like, you have to be within the confines, but usually you can find something. Like, so for example, this past week, crazy story. Like, I'm not going to pretend this happens all the time. This just happened to happen last week. Someone sent out an email to the whole firm. We just got a request from an investor for a contractual provision that says nobody that the company will not lend to Jews. So I got two responses. One response was, what kind of anti-Semitic craziness is this? We're putting into contracts you can't lend to Jews? And I got another response from a colleague of mine who's actually a graduate of Yeshiva College, who was like, this is the coolest question I've ever heard. We've got a Ribbish shaila. So as soon as I saw that question, and I thought to myself, hey, we're coming up to Bahar B'Chukosai, the Parsha is going to talk about Ribbis. I said, I don't know how, but somehow this question is going to be the intro to my drasha this week. And, and whatever, I'll figure it out. So obviously I'll be able to teach some Torah about Ribbis, and maybe this will be a halachic drasha in terms of, hey, how does halacha treat entities from a Ribbis perspective, in terms, Moshe's tshuva that if you own more than 50%, then you respect the entity. And if you're a minority shareholder, but again, like, that's just a classic example. Like, when do I prepare my drushas? I'm looking all over the place. It's like, if you're a bird watcher, bird watchers, they come home and they're like, I saw 93 birds. I'm like, I don't know, I saw a pigeon. Like, what are you talking about? You're like, if you talk to Rabbanim who have to prepare drushas, they're always looking. Their eyes are always open for something that's going to be in the drasha.
And that brings up another point to make. One more point about the style is that you have some Agada style drushes and some Halacha style drushes. You're not limiting yourself to one, and they're very different. Halacha style drush and Agada, a pure Agada drusha can be very different.
Right. No, that's for sure. That's for sure correct. And also, and this is very true in terms of that year of COVID, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, ultimately, my drusha is trying to impact and influence my community with respect to some issue that I think is important. Be it a Ben Adam L'Chavero issue, be it a Ben Adam L'Makom issue, and different content will get you there. So, like, there's a drasha here on Shabbos Nachamu, which I really like for a lot of different reasons. And the lead-in is about the fact that the Mishnah Berurah says that, it's usher to throw sticky balls at, in Shul, which is, a minhag which is talked about a little, and you kind of like, wait a second, that's crazy. What do you mean they were throwing sticky balls in Shul? And that's really an agadic drasha where I bring down some Hasidic stories about how, you had a young man who was throwing sticky balls, and the Hasidic Rebbe was like, oh, that person, that's the reason why he's not bringing the Geula, that the Geula is not here. And then the next day they saw the exact same individual crying, and I kind of use that as a insight into, hey, look, it's Shabbos Nachamu, where we're not able to do all the kind of standard Shabbos Nachamu things. Let's talk about something vis-a-vis the halacha and the minhag of Tisha B'Av, which is insightful, a little different. We're gonna celebrate Shabbos Nachamu vis-a-vis a little bit more of a humorous idea. And then the takeaway there in particular was that, and I invite people to read the drasha inside, was that when you are experiencing Avelis at a very deep level, then you are oblivious to everything around you. And the throwing of the sticky balls was actually demonstrative of the level of Avelos that was felt in Europe vis-a-vis Tisha B'Av. Now we, if we look around our neighborhoods and our communities, we're in a far different situation than people were in Europe. It's very difficult to feel that level of Avelos. And therefore, if you had kids in the back throwing around sticky balls, that would be insane, because that in the construct of where we are, that's impossible. And similarly, kind of the idea was within a COVID context, okay, where are we today? What type of behavior and actions make sense in the context of this, of our current situation? So that's like that Russia was really, it was an explanation of Minhagim, a little kind of Mishnah Berurah here with a few stories and stuff. But that's a very different style, because I was attempting to accomplish something very different. I like that Russia for a bunch of reasons. I mentioned that I'm a classic YU product, and I really am, but I have a smattering of some other influences. And, Kol Tole B'Mazel Afilu Sefer Torah Shebeheichal. I grew up across the street from Rabbi Chaim, Rabbi Baruch Faskowitz, and his Rebbitzin, Rabbi Faskowitz went through Shanghai, knew his specialty was Yerushalmi. I had the privilege, unfortunately, when he got sick in the end, I had the privilege of visiting him. Mamish Ba'al Peh, he could go Mesechtos, just boom, 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 boom. You just sat there. He couldn't read, he couldn't do anything, and he was just Ba'al Peh. So thank God we lived across the street from them. And I grew up in this shtibel, which was like just this throwback. So I talk about the sticky balls, in the footnote, I mentioned a little bit because I have a Rebbe, a Kefed in Eretz Yisrael. He says that he was a klisheni, right? Because when he was in YU in the 40s and in the 50s and 60s, all the Shanghai crowd came to YU, and he was an American. He grew up with baseball, but all of a sudden he got exposed to these Rabbanim. So he was a klisheni, and then he would make fun of all of us and say, "Hey, you guys are all kli shlishi, kli revi." And I would raise my hand and say, "For everyone else, you're right, except I'm not a klisheni because I was too little to really appreciate it. I was too young, but I'm like that Iru klisheni because I grew up in that shul, in that shtibel, and that really had an impact on me. And that particular story of the sticky balls, like I try to convey that idea of that message that how the people around you kind of elevate and transcend their experiences and pass them on to the next generation. So I happen to like that drasha.
Very interesting. Like I said, anyone interested can see it inside. Okay, let's get to what the objective of publishing this sefer is, and also kind of I think that also should encompass the elephant in the room, which is another COVID book. We got to hear more about COVID. I don't want to hear about COVID. COVID's done. Why are we listening about COVID? Why are we talking about COVID? And I'm sure that's something you get, and you're going to get now that the book is out. So that combined with what your objective with publishing this book.
Absolutely. I can't tell you how many times I've had the interaction where I tell someone that I'm publishing a sefer, and I get this incredibly excited. That's amazing. I want to buy it. That's great. I love it. That's amazing. What's it about? And then I start explaining, and I just see their faces like drop, like, oh, no. So I want to start off by saying the sefer exists in the construct and context of COVID. It is not a COVID sefer. This is not 50 drushas about COVID. It starts off, it was generated, and the impetus for the sefer was the year of COVID and the beginning month or two of the sefer. And as you mentioned, like each week, what I've done here is that I give the drasha that I gave that week with a historical construct. So like the sefer starts the week before the lockdown, because I thought that was important to give the context of how the whole lockdown started. And it starts actually with a description of there was a meeting in Teaneck, New Jersey, amongst the RCBC, Rabbinical Council of Bergen County, where it was decided that Bergen County was going to shut down. That's where it starts. And the first few weeks are really all about the COVID and the COVID experience and the lockdown. But after that, it really goes, it was an amazing year. It was a crazy year. The drushas talk about George Floyd and Black Lives Matter. The drushas talk about the January 6th, either revolt or insurrection or protest, however you want to refer to it. The drushas talk about the GameStop stock market. The drushas talk about the passing of Rav Twersky, who lived in Teaneck and had an impact on our community. There's a drasha about when Rav Steinsaltz passed away. And so really so many things happened during that year that the sefer covers all of that. So if you are COVID, if you are COVID fatigued and you don't want to hear anything more about COVID, this is not a sefer about COVID. It lives in a COVID realm, but it's not a sefer about COVID. I wrote the sefer because I thought that it was important. I wrote the sefer for two reasons. That it's a sefer. It's a sefer with Torah in it. But there are lots of other drashos farm out there. There are people who are much wiser, greater Talmidei Chachamim than I, who can give you drashos. I wrote the sefer because I thought it was important to record as a historical document how a religious, spiritual community dealt with the trials and tribulations of a fascinating and difficult year, quote unquote, unprecedented. I put unprecedented in the title because I think we all know that word got thrown around so much in the first 2, 3, 4 months. Unprecedented. Actually, we really now know that, and especially I think you had Dr. Jeremy Brown on a few weeks ago. We really know that a lot of this stuff was actually not so unprecedented, but it was unprecedented to us. So I wrote the sefer because I wanted it to be an important historical record that people could look back at that time period, but not to mourn the time period and not to be depressed by the time period. This is not like a book you should read during Tisha B'Av or the 3 weeks, but to see how people dealt with the trials and tribulations, both personally and from a communal perspective, and how as a community, people learned from it and grew from it and came out of this experience stronger, and how the community rallied together. And I'm not saying that obviously there were tragic aspects of COVID. There were for sure. And I say in the book, there are seats that remain empty in our shuls that, because of that. But that's not what the sefer is all about. The sefer is the sefer's goal is to focus on how we overcame and how we dealt with those issues, and how, hopefully if Rahman al-Islam people have have struggles and trials and tribulations going forward, they can look back at this and say, hey, these were different things that the community did in order to overcome those types of things. So it's not a sefer about COVID. It's not a COVID book. It's a sefer that has COVID in the background.
Yeah, and it definitely is a fascinating historical document. And for those that haven't seen it, there's a link in the show's notes. You can check it out, and there should be a sample, I think, on Mosaic's website, and you can check it out in the Svarim stores, of course.
What I would mention is, as from a historical perspective, for those folks who have a bookshelf on their shelf of COVID Svarim, because they have a bookshelf on their shelf for every section, I would say this is an important historical document, because what I did, and this was not easy, I went back and I found all of the letters that we published, the RCBC published, and those documents are in the sefer. And throughout the sefer, I always reference what was going on at different periods of time. So it does function as a historical document. If you have any other COVID sefer and you're trying to figure out what was going on or why, and that's why I have this timeline in the front of the book, which is actually, every time I read it, it's always amazing, because I was like, wow, that's when that happened. That's when it shut down. That's when, Israel shut down. That's when the vaccine started. And it's just, we think we remember things, but 4 or 5 years go by and your memory kind of begins to fuse things together. So from a if you are looking for a historical document, this functions as that document as well, but that is certainly not the only function of the sefer.
So let's talk about the book itself and why also it's so fascinating as a historical document. You have a written out few-page timeline of COVID. You also have a short chronology of community announcements, as you mentioned, and you have the date, and you have the Hebrew date and English date of when it was mentioned, and then you go through each drasha, and you start with Shabbos Parshat Tetzaveh Zachar, and you mentioned that again. You have each one. You have the parsha, and then on bottom you have the date in English and in Hebrew, and you have a short historical synopsis of what happened by that drasha. And then you transcribe, you have the drasha there. You also have notes that you've added. And so something that's interesting is you'll leave in the source, sometimes even correct yourself in the note, because you wrote, this was a drasha, you made a mistake or whatever. You have also community announcements that you gave, and also WhatsApp messages and things like that. Something that's very unique and very cool about the Sefer is that at the end of some of the speeches, or some of them were short, WhatsApp voice notes, or they were short shiurim, you gave a lot of these online, a Zoom or whatever. You have the recordings, and so there are QR codes to a website that you've put together for this, and readers can scan that, and they can go and hear the actual drasha said and how you said it, and that's something else that we should get into. But I'll pause. You'll get to this, and I want to get to just the oral sermon versus the written sermon and how it differs. Is something Professor Mark Zaperstein has dealt with, and just something that's very interesting in general. Another general sermon related thing. But first, talk about the uniqueness of the book and that all the different facets. It's a very interesting and very unique book in that sense.
Right. Yeah. So, and that really speaks to kind of how the Sefer, how the book developed. I really tried very hard to be historically accurate to the best of my recollection. And the way this developed was we shut down on a Thursday, and that Friday, the only way I could communicate with the members of the shul, with the community, was to send a quick email and a quick like, hey, listen, guys, and I have this in the Sefer. Where we're shut down. There's not going to be tefillah b'tzibur. Let's all daven at the same time and let's try to remain connected. And then each week what started happening was that each week I started sending either a voice note. We have a shul WhatsApp group, so I started sending a voice note. And then what I realized was, hey, some people, and I got this feedback, some people wanted to actually print them out, and while they were davening, kind of either over sometime over Shabbos, read it as part of their Shabbos experience. So then I started sending the voice note, and then I also started typing it out and sending it out. And then as we reopened, I was like, oh, now that we're reopened, oh my God, I can stop typing them, because it takes a lot longer to type out a whole drasha than it does just to do the regular footnote preparation. But I realized a lot of people were still not coming back to shul. So I was still sending them out for a very long time, for a long period of time afterwards. And that's really what happened here. And then while I was preparing the Sefer, all of a sudden I realized that all the voice notes that I had done, I had most of them. Some of them disappeared in my WhatsApp. I don't know why, but I was able to find a lot of them. And then, so I realized what could be, how cool is that here you have the written drasha, and then you have the oral presentation. I mentioned, you mentioned Professor Saperstein, and I mentioned this in the Sefer. When I listened to the voice note, I was a little surprised, because I can't really hear myself speak, but what I noticed, which was amazing, was that I didn't realize how much the darshan interacts with the community, interacts with the people that you're speaking with. And as I'm speaking, I realize, oh, that joke didn't go over well, or, oh, a bunch of people are actually closing their eyes now. Let me get a little louder, or let me go back. I see that people didn't understand something, and I reiterate it. And here I was just doing these voice notes. I was just sitting in my study, kind of talking to myself. And so you have actually three elements. You have the written drasha, which is fundamentally different than an oral presentation. And actually, when I was putting the Sefer together, I struggled with that, because I didn't want to lose the voice of an oral drasha, but you can't write the way you talk. It just, then you read that, you're like, this is in English. Like that's not a proper presentation. So I was struggling with how to find that tone of still making it clear that this was an oral presentation, but not having people read this and say, oh this person doesn't know how to read English, doesn't know how to write English. So, and then there's this middle ground of an oral presentation, but not an interactive presentation. And I just found for myself, and I think anyone who speaks publicly or interacts with the crowd, even if you've just given the Dvar Torah to Shalom Zachar, you speak at your Shabbos table, they know you just speak differently, and people ask questions, and there's just a different interaction. So that I think is reflected in the Sefer, and I think is actually, if you're interested in sermons and drushas and kind of that aspect of it as well, I think that's picked up in the Sefer as well.
What was it like to prepare those historical synopsis in the beginning of each drasha?
So the historical synopsis took a long time, and actually I put a footnote at the first one, which was, I acknowledge that I used no scientific methodology to decide how to curate which historical events made it into the synopsis. I could have just gone to like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Yated and just said, every week I'm going to give you the headline that week. But the reality was, what I was trying to present was, why did I give this drasha? Why did I speak about this topic? And it was important to kind of give people a feeling. It was important to me to give people a feeling of what was going on in the world that week. So what I did was, I really had three main sources. I went back online to this website called Win Calendar, and it just tells you like the social media things that were the most popular that week. And I kind of looked through those. And then also at the law firm, we were struggling with work from home as well. And what the law firm decided was that the presiding partner was going to do these town hall meetings all the time. And he kind of presented information and news. So, and then there was what was going on in Teaneck as well. So kind of as like a good example of kind of a very broad example, look at Shabbos Parashas Naso. I start off by saying lockdowns across the country continue. Washington, D.C. prepares for massive demonstrations as protests continue across the United States and around the world in response to the death of George Floyd. And then I say members of the Jewish community debate the merits of joining local Black Lives Matter protests against racism and police brutality as segments of the BLM movement support anti-Israel and arguably anti-Semitic positions. So that was the background. We're in lockdown. Somehow, because of the murder of George Floyd, there are protests going on. And then as a community, we were struggling with, well, Jews have always been historically very, involved in the civil rights movement. But at the same time, the Black Lives Movement is not a great movement. And actually, here I drop a footnote, which is I thought, and I do this throughout kind of from important historical point, was that in 2020, Black Lives Matter was, there was concern about whether it was an anti-Semitic movement. By the time this book came out, post October 7th, there was no doubt at all. It doesn't alter the fundamental question of, which I think is a fascinating communal and Jewish question, which is if something is right, if racism is incorrect, and we need to speak out about that, how do we deal with joining forces with a movement that we don't necessarily agree with? And that obviously applies within the Orthodox world, kind of in terms of how do we deal with other streams of Judaism. It applies everywhere. So the message is still very important, but I couldn't leave it out. I couldn't leave it in the book. I couldn't leave it in the Sefer that there was, Black Lives Matter. I wonder if that's good or bad. In 20 years from now, people will go back and they will read that footnote and they'll be like, no, we don't, which is also an interesting point, which is that we always look at history through the hindsight of what we know today. When I mention vaccines in the book, it's important to go back and analyze how we dealt with these things based on what we knew then, not based on what we know 5 years later, based on kind of, I don't want to get political, whatever you think about vaccines, good, bad, but at the time in 2020, that was a whole different way. So that's why another thing why I thought, important to give these historical contexts. But obviously it's curated based on what was impacting me. But the reality is what was impacting me was impacting what I spoke about and what I spoke about the Joshs. The one thing I did do is that I found a very liberal colleague at my office. And trust me, it's not difficult to find liberal colleagues at my office, but I found a very liberal colleague. And I asked if they could look through the historical summaries and tell me, did they think I was, because I was concerned that I was, if anything, I'm obviously probably further to the right, certainly further to the right than many of my colleagues at the office. And I did like a sanity and a reality check just to make sure that I wasn't just, that somehow there was a middle ground. And some of it is serious, some of it is funny. Like I mentioned here that there was this video that went viral that, there was a lawyer who was on a Zoom court case and he couldn't get his cat filter off the screen. So he did the entire trial as a cat, just to people were kind of like, oh yeah, I remember that. I remember all the crazy things where no one had it and knew how to use Zoom. So that's really the goal of the historical part, to kind of, put you in the mood of what was going on that week.
Yeah, and it's an important point you make. For example, taking the vaccines, something that this podcast has a lot of history. And the vaccines, today, that they were recording it, the FDA just came out and said they're no longer recommending COVID vaccine boosters. And in fact, any of the vaccine makers, I think, have to go through clinical trials and things like that. So, things have changed drastically in just a few years. So even just now, forget 20 years, people looking back going, well, look at, what is he writing there? So again, this is a historical document. You're putting in the footnotes, sometimes, and not always, you've added in what it is today versus what it is then. So, but more than anything, that goes to show how this is a historical document of what was going on at the time. And things obviously have changed and are always changing and moving. As we're, it's interesting because many are used to reading, history books or historical documents from hundreds of years ago. And you're like, now we can just look back and almost like case closed. And so obviously not, but the case closed on certain things, as opposed to here where things are still shifting and moving. And it's like this historical book, Sefer, is coming out. So as you said, it's really, there's the Torah here, and then there's the history and the historical document, how you really try to craft this into a historical document. And I don't know if you mentioned, maybe you did, but why you decided to put the QR codes and whose idea that was. It's very interesting to make a website and to actually put those codes inside the Sefer.
So I'll tell you, once I found the content, and I realized, and I was trying to figure out, how do I build this content into the Sefer? Because I found it fascinating. And the truth is that my father had published a book, and I mentioned he's a basketball coach. He had published a book on basketball fundamentals, and he was what he came up with was like he put these QR codes that it could take you to a video so you could see how to play basketball. And I mentioned that I was like, wow, that's it. I'm going to put these QR codes, then I'll put it online. And that's how I got the initial idea. I have to tell you, subsequently, I'm sure other people have thought of this. I saw in Rav Rimon's recent halachic svarim on Hilchos Pesach that in his Haggalah section and in his Kashrus section, he too has QR codes that takes you to a video that shows you how to do it. So I think, look, obviously, for the Sefer is never going away because of Shabbos, but I think this is the next stage of the development of Svarim, where somehow we're going to, that interaction between online and the classic book is going to continue to develop. Unfortunately, I have QR codes for about maybe 10 or 15 of the Svarim of the drashas, and I have one QR code for some additional content. I have a drasha on. I'll mention this because it's the Svarim chatter. I had a drasha the week of the YU Svarim sale, because the YU Svarim sale got canceled, and he kind of like, so a lot of people, like, of all the things that got canceled, like in the big picture, the YU, but what I said was, look, for Am HaSefer, the people of the book, for the Svarim sale to get canceled, we can mourn that. It doesn't mean that it's equal to the other things that people are going on, but hey, the Svarim sale got canceled. And then I went into a whole, the Torah there as well discusses how things change over time. And then I wanted to reference some pictures that kind of show how different things changed. And so there I have the QR code, and I take it to some pictures. Well, I'd like to mention that there are several pictures in color in the Sefer, which I think really came out beautifully, and kol hakavod to Mosaica. I mentioned that sticky ball controversy, so I have pictures of the sticky ball. I have pictures of how our shul was set up the weeks of COVID. We talked about the public announcements. So the week before Sukkot, people forget there was an uptick. We unlocked, we came out, and then there was an uptick right before Yontif. So right before Sukkot, everyone was worrying about that. So the week before Sukkot, we talked about building COVID-safe sukkahs, and I have some pictures of the sukkahs that we discussed and described. How to build a COVID-safe sukkah. And again, because there's an index in the back, you just look in the back. You look for sukkah. You look for you look for the public announcements regarding that, and you have those pictures there. So the pictures, again, for a historical document, the pictures I think are a very nice touch, and they really, in my humble opinion, I think they really enhance the Sefer.
Do you have a favorite drasha in the Sefer?
Do I have a favorite drasha in the Sefer? That's a great question. I actually think my favorite drasha is the first introductory drasha. And by the way, when I presented that drasha, that was actually given live. That was given live. And what had happened was, and I mentioned this in the historical note, we were just beginning to hear of COVID, and you read these reports that 9 million people in China were locked down, and you kind of like, well, that's insane. And people like quarantined for 2 weeks. So that first drasha, people started talking about social distancing, which was a concept that had never been heard before. Or at least, I apologize, had never been heard by me. Maybe people in infectious disease knew about it, but it had never been heard to me. So I did the classic thing of the rabbi. I started with a joke, and the joke was something that had been going around on the internet, which was that the Israeli health authorities have put out a statement saying that you should try to limit your physical interactions with one another. And that's how all Sephardim should make sure to be careful, and all Ashkenazim should just continue as normal. Playing on the tropes of Ashkenazim being, like yeki, separate, etc. And then the Torah part is, discusses the fact that when Moshe had to dress Aaron HaKohen to become Kohen Gadol, the intimacy of those scenes are very surprising and very unusual. It actually seems that Moshe is chayav to put the beged, put the miknasayim on Aaron. And the question is, what's going on there? And if you go back and you look to the interaction between Yosef and his brothers, we see that, and here it's pshat, again, it's a pshat perush, that we see that the brothers were not appeased until Yosef hugged the brothers. And the Mefarshim explained that there was the physical contact between Yosef and his brothers that finally convinced the brothers that Yosef wasn't going to take vengeance against them. And using that same idea, saying that Aaron was concerned that Moshe was jealous, and it was only when the physical contact took place that that Aaron became relieved and felt that Moshe was truly doing it, without any acrimony. And then the takeaway there was, hey, the whole world is rethinking physical interactions. How about us? We need to rethink physical interactions as well, both from a halachic perspective, both in terms of amongst our own families, and also from a halachic perspective in terms of in the workplace and how we interact physically. So I thought, from my perspective, to be able to relate to something that was going on in the world because everyone was thinking about social distancing, to relay a really nice piece of Torah in terms of a machlokas, to be able to explain a unusual pasuk, and then to have a takeaway of something which I think is really important, was really important then, and I think continues to be incredibly important in terms of we live in a society that is so physically focused, and when we go in the outside world, I'd say kind of our morals on these issues are so distant. And I'm sorry, I don't want to preach here. Are so distant from our personal things. So it's something. These are things that we need to think about. And so, from my perspective, I really like that, John.
And now you mentioned earlier about the sources you usually use, and when we talked about the style. But are there generally sources when you're preparing a drasha? Sources, and specifically as it pertains to this book, which is in general, are there certain sources that you go to? You mentioned Torah Tamimos, even if any for others. Are there, would you say, like core sources that you generally use for a drasha, or again, you look for an idea and then you just pick around?
So I would say for sure, I look for an idea and then I start to look for an issue. I definitely, the core sources that I use when I'm preparing a drasha is once I find an issue or a question, is to go through this kind of the classic Rishonim, Rashi, Ramban, Ibn Ezra, and usually between those types of sources. And I usually like to find that machlokas and focus on what the nekudas machlokas is, and then kind of take it from there. I certainly am biased to. I'm biased to the Netziv. I expect probably the most sources are from Hayim Davar. I'm biased to the Torah Tamima, so I guess I have a bias to that particular family. And I'm biased to the Malbim because again, those types of meforshim are very kind of they work very well in terms of the things I'm trying to do. The Rabbi is also very helpful because he always has the toelet, so maybe he'll have a parish on the mean, but then that toelet is usually something that I can take and translate into the sefer. In terms of so that's kind of in terms of just if I'm doing pure in the parsha. Once I'm outside of the parsha and I'm just kind of in the world of halacha, then it's all over the place. I mentioned I have a section here on some of the not only the books that are mentioned in the sefer, not only the svarim that are mentioned in the sefer, but in the bibliography. I also have a bibliography of online sources. So I'll give away some of my trade secrets here. If you search online in Hebrew, Yeshivat Har Etzion has an incredible amount of content on their website. Every once in a while, I find the gem from some of the other Hesdez yeshivas. If you go into the Hamayan from Machon Olman, from Shalavim, I somehow got linked up with the Israel National Library. There's the chief librarian has a blog which he sends out every week. He actually hasn't been sending it out so much, but always fascinating stuff. I'll give a shout out to Rav Broid on the Sfarim blog. You just kind of you're seeing stuff all the time, and you just say yes, that's where you go for. But there's a tremendous amount that's online that I oftentimes call from. But I don't know, it's just stuff shows up. Stuff shows up.
Right, for sure. And so, okay, so that's really, again, so the sefer. So again, it starts with that first drasha. Again, you have the timeline in here, then you have the chronology. You start the first drasha with Shabbos Parshas Tzav Zachar, and then you go through until the last drasha in the sefer is, again, Shabbos Parshas Tzav Shushan Purim. That's the last drasha. So it's a year's worth of drashas. You get a snapshot, like you said, of an entire year. Is that why? How'd you pick the beginning is obvious, but how'd you pick the end?
Yeah, so that I was trying to give a snapshot of the exact end, which is always kind of one of those classes. Sometimes you'll see the yeshiva will have their 50th year anniversary, but they'll have it 4 years in a row because always oh, when did we really start? So when did the year really begin? How did you really end the year? So that's kind of I was trying to look around to see kind of when it started and when it ended. Also, the parashas don't always correlate with the same holiday. So Purim, Purim could be before and before or after. But that's I was trying to end one full year from the official lockdown of the state of New Jersey, and I believe that that's what I got, February 27th. I'm just looking at the timeline here to make sure that that's accurate. But that was the goal to
timeline is
do.
useful, you see.
I also wanted, from a safer perspective, to be able to give something to someone that I say, look, here's something on every parsha of the year, which it's not 100% because for some of the drashos they weren't parsha related. I went afield into some other halachic or yantiv or other type of topic, but that was the goal. I wanted to do one full cycle, and also I should mention, so like there are like bigger shiurim. Like that year I gave the Shabbos Hagadol drasha on Zoom, not on Shabbos, but on Motzei Shabbos on Zoom. And what was also interesting there was because I was on Zoom, I was able to do some multimedia stuff. In the Shabbos Hagadol drasha. So I recreated that whole drasha and I put all the makoros in, and I actually have some of the links to the website there. And I gave a Shabbos Shuvah drasha under the trees. It started raining in the middle. We ran out. So I have all the sources for the Shabbos Shuvah drasha on Shavuos. We're headed towards Shavuos. So that first Shavuos, we were still in lockdown. So the question that was, within the community was, how do you do Tikkun Leil Shavuos when you're all by yourself? So what we did was, I sent out self-guided makoros to the community and said, hey, if you want to, and I like that drasha as well. I gave a drasha on the idea that there are shomrim outside the mikdash, and the question, and there was actually an initiative to reinstate those shomrim around Har HaBayis. In the midst of like the second Aliyah. So I discussed how the idea that why are there shomrim there, what's their purpose, are they there for security, or are they there for kavod haTorah, that there should be shomrim by the mikdash. And I said, Tikkun Leil Shavuos, you're not going to have your program, you're not going to have your shiurim, you're not going to have your cheesecake, you're not going to have your sushi and your barbecue, whatever people do, but it's important for people to stay up and be the shomrim of Tikkun Leil Shavuos. And so I sent out these guided sources. So that's in the Sefer as well. So and those are included as well. So it really hits upon the whole, full machzor hashana, the full year cycle. That was really the goal. Did I get it perfectly? I don't know, but that was really the goal.
Right, and as you mentioned before, other events that weren't COVID related that were going on during the year, and then you have in the appendices the real historical, totally historical, really going through all the different documents instead of the RCBC and what was going on in TNX. So you have that anyone can see and can check that out, and then you have the indices in the back as well. So there's a lot, there's a lot of material. The book is
shout out to another historical document. I have an appendix which is a letter from Rabbi Maurice Liu, who was the rabbi of a shul in London in the 40s. And the letter describes how they're going to celebrate Kol Nidre and Yom Kippur in the midst of the Blitz, and how they had to bring their gas masks to shul for the Blitz. And I was contrasting that to the fact that we were under a tent and it was hot or whatever. But I have that letter in the appendix as well, which was not so easy. I mentioned it because it was not so easy to find and put in. I put a lot of effort into getting that letter. So I just mentioned it.
So, in closing, again, we mentioned, there's Torah and there's history and historical document, and QR codes, all the uniqueness of the book. And like you said, it was nice. You had color pictures. Mosaic did a great job in that. But who would you say the book is meant for, / who will enjoy this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are kind of three categories of people who will enjoy the book. If you have an appreciation for history, Jewish history, and Jewish history documents, I think you will enjoy the Sefer because it was aimed, and its goal was to put things in the historical context. And I think if you have an atiyah for history, you will enjoy the Sefer. I think, as I mentioned, there are lots of tremendous svarim out there for Parsha, but if you enjoy Parshanut, you enjoy learning the Parsha, I think there are a lot of very nice ideas in here, and you can easily pull out the Sefer having nothing to do with COVID. You just want to have a Parsha idea on a specific Parsha. You pull it out, you look at the index, you look at the sources, you'll find it right away. So I think that's a population that will enjoy the Sefer. If you preach, if you give drashos, if you give sermons, if the idea of the history of sermons interests you, we mentioned Mark Saperstein. There are drashos of the Noda Yehuda. There are other famous drashos out there. I'm not chas v'shalom comparing my sefer to that, but if you if you like that type of historical analysis of trying to understand how did this what was the background of this tshuva? Why did the Rav discuss this? What does that mean? I think if you have an atiyah for that type of analysis and that type of thinking, you'll enjoy this sefer as well, because you quickly see how each drasha fits into what was going on in the historical times at that point as well. And if you're related to me and you want to make me happy, then you'll enjoy the drasha as well. Enjoy the sefer as well.
There you go. So I will link to the book in the show's notes, as well as to the website as well. Again, you scan the QR codes, you can get there, but I'll link to it also. It's speakingtoanemptyshul.com. I'll link to that. You can check it out. So even without scanning the QR codes, you can just go there. You can check it out. There's all sorts of information on there on the podcast, and anyone interested can check it out. And so,
now, could I give one? Can I give one plug at the end? I would mention,
yes,
and this it was brought into so much more focus. As you had Dr. Brown on a few weeks ago. He had his sefer on the 10 plagues, and he mentioned that it was surprising that there hasn't been more religious analysis of the why of how is it possible that COVID happened. In the afterword of the book, I ask I kind of look back 5 years later, and I give the example of Chonei Ma'agal. I said, like, if you went to sleep the day before Parshas Tetzaveh and you woke up 5 years later and walked into Shul, would anything be different? Besides for a few Purell things on the bima, would you notice anything different at all? And the reality is that I think for the most part, the answer is no. And the question that I leave this is one of the reasons why I wrote the book is that a good thing or a bad thing? Does that speak to the strength of our community? Or is this terrible that God sent us this huge message called COVID, where every aspect of our lives completely got turned upside down? And 5 years later, we're like, nah, that wasn't so important. I'm not going to listen to that message. And to kind of cross advertise here, we did a pot. No, sorry, I won't mention it. So I think that's an important.
You can mention another podcast. That's fine.
So Tradition Online, the Tradition Journal, we did a podcast. We had 6 different speakers speak on that idea, and we did a podcast on that exact same idea. And I think that's an important takeaway of the Sefer as well, which is to kind of look back at things that happened and say, now it's 5 years later. Did we do that right? Did we do that wrong? Should we have done it differently? But I just find it so amazing. Like, look, thank God 5 years later we're back. But the world stopped. Like, everything we knew stopped. And 5 years later, we're just like, whatever.
Yeah, that's part of a longer conversation.
That's a different conversation.
Pro or con. So we'll leave that for a different time, but an interesting thought to end off with. And so, like I said, I'll link in the show's notes. You can check out the book from Mosaic Press or Amazon, and you can check out the website, speakingtoanemptyshul.com, and all of that. So anyone interested can check out more, and through the website they can contact you if they're interested, and so on. And thank you, Yehuda, for joining me to talk about the book.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. This was amazing. Really enjoyed it.